that frame. But
The connection that we were trying to make at the
yeah,
beginning of the conversation was the relationship between the descent of the Divine Mother into the created order and the fact that she is descending to us again here at the western ends of the earth in our time. And just as 2,000 years ago she gave birth to the age in which we are now laboring, she is now giving birth to an age in which we will be liberated from the darkness of our time. Because just as every child is born out of the darkness of its own mother's womb, we as a people, as a culture, as a spiritual culture, as a civilization, are being born out of the darkness of this age into the light of the age to come. And just as this age, the present age, was born in a little circle of adepts and Essenes and even Pharisees and even Buddhists and little circles of individuals who were privy to the things that were unfolding in that time. From that small remnant of individuals and schools of thought that existed in that time, we have now become millions and millions of individuals in our time in whom this state of consciousness is being born. So this age that is in the process of emerging out of the darkness of this age is literally being born in the hearts and the minds of
people everywhere.
people everywhere.
Is there a relationship presently today where that tantric gravitational pull is in fact the relationship between the Divine Mother and the Divine Father giving birth to this new age? I mean, does the concept replay itself over and over and over again? For example, before we talked about how the Heavenly Father as the Sun and the Divine Mother as the Earth came together to form life. And today, you know, I can edit out all these questions and make them more concise.
Yeah.
But today, what I'm trying to get you to talk about is how, you know, the Divine Father in the East, without getting too much into it, but
Sure.
how the Heavenly Father is preparing or I should say, more importantly, is the Divine Mother is descending once again into our field of consciousness to give birth and to bring balance to an imbalanced world.
Not only is the Divine Mother descending into our field of consciousness, but in the beginning she descended in to the force field of matter itself. And that force field of matter is revealed in the structure and in the dimensions of the universal oracle, which is the world tree, the tree of life. And so by reaching into that symbol, the tree of life, just as it says in the book of Revelation, those who overcome will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. By reaching in to the symbol of the oracle, which is the tree, and by understanding the corresponding discipline of study, which attends the oracle, which is the Kabbalah, we are able to relate these two, the symbol, the oral traditions which attend the symbol, the canon of Scripture, which was handed down in parallel form with these oral traditions, and the unfolding realities of our time. And when we begin to see the correlations that exist between each of these aspects of her presence in our time and in our lives, we begin to we begin to attain to a clearer and more concise interpretation and vision of the meaning of our times. And we are able then to relate what is going on now before our very eyes by following all the pathways that lead into and out of the tree of life, out into the phenomenal world. We're able to connect the ideas that were ensouled in matter at the time of the birth of the universe, those very same ideas and impulses that were ensouled in the mind of Adam when God, in their unified field as father and mother, began to elevate the mind of humanity in the presence of this first archetypal Adamic couple. Well, those ideas which first energized the thinking of Adam gave birth to a set of precepts and concepts that took root and that took hold in the emerging consciousness of, at that time, Western man, early Western man. Because you see, the Epic of Adam begins in the context of the end of the Atlantean age. Adam is an Atlantean, and it is in the context of the end of that age that this new dispensation is born. The law now emerges in the world. And it's only from the time of Adam up until our own time that man can be in transgression of the Torah, because before that time there was no law. Man was living in his natural, vegetated, emerging, evolving state of consciousness. But until the time of Adam, he was still in a state of relative darkness compared to the state of understanding that was quickened in the mind of humanity with Adam.
So what's the metaphor of the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden?
Well, it's a creation myth, and
but specifically relating to Adam.
Well,
I've heard you express before they're the first monotheists.
yes. Adam is, again, not the first human beings. Adam is the first individual couple, archetypal couple.
Adam, not Adam and Eve.
No, not Adam and Eve, because the idea of Adam and Eve is a great mystery. The Apostle Paul expresses it in the 5th chapter of Ephesians, where when alluding to the story of Adam and Eve, he says, this is a great mystery, but I am speaking of Christ and the church. So when the mind of the universe reveals itself to this first archetypal couple, and we read in the book of Genesis, now this is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man. Male and female created he them, and called their name Adam. We don't have a case here of he being Adam and she being Eve, but he is Adam and she is Adam. And so what we understand is that they were the first Christs. They were the first anointed ones in the world. They were anointed with an understanding from the higher dimensions of reality of the very presence of the one God who is both Father and Mother, light and darkness, above and below, good and evil. All of these things flow from the one. Adam was the first individuals to understand this, at least for that moment in time. And they caught a glimpse of God's presence in the sum of reality itself. And they began now to sense the seriousness of sharing their ideas with others. Because we can, by studying into the oracles, realize that the times in which Adam was created, the mind of Adam was created, were much akin to the times in which we live. Just as Adam existed at the height of the emerging conflict of the Atlantean civilization, which eventually came to its conclusion in the metaphorical floods of Noah's time, approximately 1,000 to 1,600 years later. We are now living at the end of an age in which modern Atlantis has reached its climax. We are now passing through the crises of these times, as Adam must have experienced a crisis in their time, which required a new revelation, which required a higher way of interpreting those times. And that higher way of interpreting those times came from the mind of the universe itself, and in essence said to Adam, look, here you see into the world in which you live, and you see all of these forces in the universe, apparently contradictory and working in cross purposes to each other. This seems to be against that. The light seems to be inimical to the day. What you perceive to be good, working in contradistinction to what you perceive to be evil. Well, what Adam all of a sudden realized is that the good and the evil came from the same source. And there was a reason and a purpose for both of these aspects of divine reality playing out in the world, because a creation story was unfolding. And Adam was the first to receive an understanding of that story, that God was now creating a state of higher consciousness, which our ideas of good and evil would transcend the very ideas of good and evil that their generation held, and which defined and gave meaning to their relationships to the world. Go ahead. Well,
Go ahead.
The point I was trying to make is that we must assume that there was, at some primal and some local level, conflicts being waged between the various groups and tribes of individuals that lived in Adam's time. And Adam was concerned about the idea of human conflict and human warfare in the very same way that we are now concerned about it, but on a worldwide scale. And when God revealed themselves to Adam, the mind of Adam, Adam realized that God permeated the whole of existence. And that just as God was taking up residence in their own mind, they understood that God was present in every living thing. Indeed, God was present in all things, whether they were biological, organic, mineral, or animal. There was God. They saw that there was nothing but God. So this couple, who are now unified in their relationship to each other and in their definition of this revelation that they were sharing, went out into the world of their time, attempting to sow the seeds of this state of consciousness into the hearts of others. And in their attempt to sow the seed, they will attain to the metaphor that will divide from all time, throughout all time from then until now, the difference between the terms man and the term woman. It is purely metaphor. The term man and the term woman has little to do with the physical reality of the male and female gender. From the time of Adam, the term man applies to any individual, whether they be male or female, who possesses within themselves, because of their own higher state of consciousness, the ability to sow the seed of this state of consciousness into the heart of the other, defines whether a person is in the spiritual order a man or not. A woman in the spiritual order is anyone, whether they be male or female, who is receiving the seed of understanding into themselves. So they become the receptive vessel. So now all of a sudden, immediately, we discover the metaphor of Adam, who is the male and female, capable of understanding this mystery. Together, having a first-hand experience with God themselves. These are the first to receive the revelation, now are going out into the world, trying to sow an understanding of this revelation into the hearts of others. And as they do, these others to whom they are going become their church. And as the others begin to hear the revelation from this Adam, who is this male and the female, who are two witnesses agreeing with each other, yes, this is true, this is true. She is explaining it from a feminine side, the feminine perspective. He is explaining it from the male perspective. And so a whole new order of understanding is emerging in the earth. It's based upon balance. It's based upon harmony of understanding. It's based upon a relationship between these two and the two which dwell above, who are in essence one, and out of whose universal presence all things flow.
So why is Eve created from a rib?
Well, of course, again, it's metaphor, because the Divine Mother is the author. She is wisdom herself. She's the author of these metaphors. And it is in the poetic expression of her own mind that we begin to relate to the beauty of this this created order itself, because we understand that it is through the literary devices that the Divine Mother has devised herself, she who is wisdom. Through those devices, she will begin to separate the mind of darkness from the mind of light. And the mind of light will always have access to the hidden underlying meanings of these sacred stories, where the mind of darkness will be denied access to the stories, because just as they look into the world with their physical eyes, they read these sacred texts or interpret the oral stories that are handed down to them with a literal exoteric perspective. And so the Divine Mother is now laying the groundwork in her relationship with Adam through story, myth, metaphor, and parable, because that's how she's relating these most basic of stories, laying the groundwork that will, by the time the Vedas are being composed after the collapse of the Atlantean Age, and later on when the Torah is being composed and the Gospels are being composed and the Quran is eventually composed, it is this method that was established by the Divine Mother herself that will distinguish and separate the mind of light from the mind of darkness.
What do you mean? I don't understand.
Well, what I mean is that in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Immediately, we are presented with the idea of something above and something below. And this will then become the model for the entire evolutionary process. There are some things above, and those things are hidden in the firmament. They're hidden above the firmament. This is where God dwells. God dwells beyond the range of human comprehension. There are some things now that are created below, that are within the range of human experience. But when we are reading and interpreting the world in which we live literally, and only seeing it with our physical eyes, we fail to see the esoteric reality. We fail to see that those things that were hidden above from the very beginning permeate the very structure of reality as we know it. And it's only through revelation, and then it is only through the transmission of these stories in their allegorical, metaphorical, and epic form, the literary devices that creation herself has devised, can we penetrate the meaning of those hidden structures.
I'm still
And
lost,
the meaning of the stories.
because are you in some way saying that at the time of Adam, God set into motion the element of darkness and the element of light?
Well, the element of darkness and light always existed from the moment of creation. What was happening in the time of Adam is that God was revealing a higher meaning to the mind of Adam of the concepts of light and darkness. These concepts of light and darkness that Adam was now understanding has to do with the higher realms of knowledge and ignorance. Light and darkness in their horizontal constructions represent to the minds of primal man the very issues of life and death. So life and death was understood purely on the physical plane. If you were dead, you were dead. If you were alive, you were alive. Blood was coursing through your veins. If you were dead, you were a corpse. But all of a sudden, in the revelation to Adam, a whole new idea of light and darkness, life and death appears. And Adam can see, oh yes, even though people are alive physically, they are dead spiritually. And even though they may be walking in a physical body, if they understand the ideas that we're sharing with them, they are alive spiritually. So the idea of as above, so below begins to take root in the philosophical comprehensions of the children of Adam, which will, of course, this concept will evolve and will define and inform throughout all future generations the methods through which the mystics and the adepts will look into and define and interpret the outer dimensions of reality themselves. The law of correspondences, which simply says whatever you see has a deeper meaning. Whatever you're looking at has a higher meaning.
It's a reflection.
It's a reflection of some aspect of the
Divine
higher
order of God.
Yes, yes. So every word, every term, every structure, every phenomena of the material, physical world contains within itself a message, an idea, a coded meaning, which allows the mind who possesses the sight to understand something essential about the higher order, no matter what it is. And so this process of revelation, these literary processes that will separate the mind of light from the mind of darkness, have their root in the revelation to Adam. But they didn't appear out of a vacuum, because Adam is created out of all that existed before them. The human order and the elements of nature and the relationship of primal man to his natural environment, an evolutionary process that has been taking place and unfolding for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years in the earth until this moment.
So then what's the deal with the apple?
Well, of course, the whole symbolism of the tree of life will now appear in our myth, our stories. The tree of life is not a physical thing. The tree of life is the tree of life is primarily an idea. The tree of life is the means whereby and through which God will provide to the children of Adam throughout all the centuries and millennia from the time of Adam to our own, the means by which they can begin to record and save no, let me rephrase that. This can be edited out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The tree of life. The tree of life is an idea that in its most primitive dimensions will begin to inform the mind of Adam, and it will begin to
compel.
Compel.
Okay, wrong.
No. It will. The tree of life. We go back to the very time of Genesis, and the only way we can get back there is to actually follow our sacred text back to that moment in time. And we find ourselves in the book of Genesis, in the second chapter. But even prior to the Torah, even prior to the book of Genesis, we find ourselves back at the in the pages of the Vedas, which are prior to the Torah. In the book of Genesis, as well as in the Rig Veda, we discover the idea, the concept of the tree of life, this universal world tree that by the time of the Vedas, and certainly by the time of the Torah, is beginning to take a very manifest and concrete form in the thinking of Western man. But prior to the time in which the tree of life began to take its structural form, it existed in concepts and ideas. Those concepts and ideas are those in which the mind of Adam was first imbued. Adam received some basic understandings about his relationship, their relationship to the heavens. And so we'll begin to see, as we look back into those times, that those civilizations and those schools of thought that characterize the intellectual and spiritual pursuits that resulted from the initial revelation to Adam are devoted wholly to the study of natural events, whether it be the study of plants, the nature of animals, the relationship between man to the geological formations of the earth, sacred places, but also in his relationship to the heavens. And the next 1,000, 2,000 years are spent gazing into the heavens, setting up astronomical observatories, wondering about the shape of things, what ideas, because now he knows that there are higher ideas residing in the universe. And he will, because of this initial revelation to Adam, begin to try to discover those meanings, discover those ideas wherever they are hidden and wherever they are revealing themselves, and wherever they are giving meaning to his emerging need to understand.
But why the temptation? What is it about the apple, the serpent, the temptation, the tree of good and evil? God forbade man in the Garden of Eden of eating of this tree.
Well, again, we begin to see that the story in Genesis is based upon a creation myth, an epic myth that has its roots in true historical and metaphysical reality. The tree of life originally was not a thing, but rather it was a set of ideas that will take form over the next ensuing thousands of years. And finally, as these ideas take shape, as they take form in the thinking of Adam's children, as Adam's children go throughout the earth and confirm their own revelations with the revelations that God has been giving to all the other peoples of the earth, as they begin to confirm what they understand of God with what others are understanding about reality as they understand it, little by little, a structure will appear. Little by little, mandalas that are common to all civilizations, through which and upon which all civilizations can interpret their place in the center of reality. Well, the children of Adam will then go into the earth and they'll begin to compare their revelation with the understandings of all the other peoples, and they will then form schools of adepts, schools of mystics, schools of teachers and students, through which this ancient wisdom can be translated from one part of the earth to the other, from one culture to the other. And in the process of comparing ideas, sharing philosophical notions about the nature of the universe, the structure of the tree of life will begin to take form.
Where?
It will begin to take form in the mind of the adepts in the teachings of Adam.
Wait, I think what you're saying is Adam, a couple, the Christs of their time, standing at a vortex or what we've come to term as a paradigm shift. We've had several of them. The age of Moses, the age of Christ, what we're in right now. Paradigm shifts in human history. Receives this revelation. They become monotheists. They understand the order of all things. They understand the divine above and the divine below. They begin to go out and sow the seed of this understanding into the minds and hearts of their friends, families, communities. These ideas begin to spread before they're ever written.
Yes.
And as these ideas become more and more manifest, they crystallize and become clearer, more comprehensible, more tangible to the minds and hearts of men and, I should say, males and females, or humankind.
Mm-hmm.
At that course in history, they spread. These ideas spread, and perhaps God reveals themselves to the minds of the Taoists, similarly as he does to the Adamics.
Yes.
Correct or not?
Yes.
And so as the descendants of Adam go out into the earth, they perhaps migrate into the Asian peninsulas, or let's say they head that way. They're spreading into Egypt, into Africa. They're moving out into the world. They come across other individuals, and they sit in these circles, and they confirm their ideas with one another. So now they're finding that they're not alone in the world, that they are in fact correct in their understanding, in their realizations, in their traditions, in the stories, in the legends that have been being passed down for thousands of years.
Yes.
And then they begin to take these fellowships of these mystery schools, if you will. They begin to then take to the task of writing down these stories, and that's of course
or
where
codifying these stories at first.
They're coding them with the symbolism that they've come to understand, known as the Tree of Life, this mandala, which has now begun to channel its way divinely, as the revelation of God does.
It's an evolutionary
minds and hearts.
process.
Right,
Yes.
it's an evolutionary process. And now that they have this tree, this symbol, they're able to write the stories in a way that can be carried forth through time, such that the mind of darkness is unable to perceive the deeper meanings, and the mind of light, of course, is able to understand the more esoteric concepts here. Why? What does that have to do? What is this light and darkness that God is creating? What is this, the temptation, what is this all representing?
We go back to the garden. Going back to the garden, literally, is coming full circle around to our own times, because we are those whom God has brought to the garden. We are those to whom the mysteries of the Tree of Life are being re-revealed. When we go back to those ancient times and we understand the words, "Let us create man in our image," we must give full weight of understanding to what that means to be created in God's image. When we understand that all the good in the universe and all of what we perceive to be evil in the universe proceeds from the mind of God, that in order for us to be created in the image of the God of the universe, in order for us to finally come to full age in what we now understand as a state of Christ consciousness, we must have a full experiential relationship with evil itself. Just as it says in the book of Hebrews, For strong meat belongs to them who are of full age, who have had their consciences exercised to understand both good and evil. In order for us to come to a full Christ-conscious state of mind, God had to release the evil impulse into the earth so that we could see not only into the depth, into the abyss, into the dark substructure of God's own consciousness, but that we could fully understand what it is that was being created in us, and that is the ability to do evil, as opposed to all of the rest of the animal kingdom. Because with the law that came to Adam came the first ability to transgress the law. As Paul said, where there is no law, where there is no Torah, there is no transgression. So Adam becomes the first individual, the first spirit in the earth capable of transgressing the law. And so immediately we see that this realization is attached to that other commandment that relates to that other tree in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of which we are told in the book of Genesis that God commanded us not to partake of. Well, just as the tree of life is literally a symbol for all of the higher ideas that permeate the universe, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is also not a thing, but rather a metaphor for human experience itself. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not anything that we could have avoided partaking of, because it is built into our own lower nature. It is built into the epic story, the descent of the soul from the higher world into physical matter. When it descends into the earth, it descends into the mystery of the human soul, the mystery of the consciousness of good and evil itself.
This is rather disturbing, because I think what you're telling me is that God has created this whole fudged up situation. Let me try again.
It's not fudged up. It's
no, but wait.
okay.
If Eve just wouldn't have given Adam the apple to eat, we wouldn't have the problems we have today. We wouldn't have starving. We wouldn't have oppression. We wouldn't have war. We wouldn't have destruction. If man could have just contained himself and herself, then we could be living in a much better place. But you're telling me God has devised some... I mean, it's sadistic.
Well, at first blush, it might appear sadistic, but we have to be able to reason with the mind of the universe itself. In order for God to create us in their image, God had to bring us to a state of divine consciousness. God had to allow us to experience within ourselves all that God is. And what God is the source of all good and evil.
God is the author of evil?
God is not simply the author of it. The evil that we have experienced in the universe for the last 6,000 years, but much more intensely in the last epoch, the epoch of our own age, flows from the very mind of the universe itself. the evil impulse that exists in man was created in man so that he could exercise himself of it. You see, if when God commanded Adam not to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if Adam had obeyed and had not partaken of the fruit of human experience itself, would not have dared to experience the pleasures of life, the adventures of life, the well, we always use the metaphor of a child growing up in a home where there is a wood stove, let's say. The parent it's wintertime and the wood stove is blazing away and there's heat emanating into the house and all things seem good. And the parent says to the child, "Now, darling, don't touch that stove. That stove is extremely hot. If you touch the stove, you will get burned." Well, then the parent goes on about its business. Now the child, who is a growing, seeking, maturing, evolving creature, a soul, emanating from the mind of God itself, might remain obedient. And if it does, it will grow up without any personal experience. If it does not touch the stove, it will not have an understanding of the concept of hot. And therefore, as it grows, and when it sees its peers, its other people of its own generation, experimenting with life, with all aspects of life, that soul who is fearful of experimenting themselves or touching or tasting or feeling or being any part involved with what they perceive to be disobedience to the we always use the metaphor, or we have used the metaphor of a child who grows up in a home, and perhaps the home is heated by a wood stove. And the parent in that home, loving their child, as we assume God loves us, says to the child, "Now, darling, please don't touch that stove. It's wintertime now, we've got the stove lit. If you touch it, you will get burned. And if you get burned, well, then we'll be sad and you'll be sad." Well, then the parent goes on about its own business, and now the child is looking at the stove and wondering about the concept of hot. The fact is that if that child does not find some conscious or unconscious means of touching that stove, or in some way or another experiencing for itself what it means to be burned, or at least what the sensation of hot or heat is, they will never have this experience for themselves. And having no personal experience with the meaning of life, or the fullest meaning of their relationship to the elements of creation itself, they will never come to full maturity. And there's a danger of them growing up to be tattletales when they begin to see others having the experiences that they themselves are too fearful to have. So God is the same way. God knows full well that in order for us to grow up, to evolve into fully mature, divine creatures, knowing the mind of deity itself, understanding the difference between good and evil, we must find, or Adam, the children of Adam, the spirit of Adam in the earth had to find, whether consciously or unconsciously, some means of releasing the evil impulse in the world. Some means of experiencing that which it intuitively knew it should not.
Why?
Well, because, first off, if Adam in the Garden of Eden, our metaphorical couple, our archetypal couple, had been able to look into the 20th century, if they could have seen the things that are unfolding in the world at this time in history, they would have gone to great lengths not to create, in their own lives at least, the conditions that would lead to these unfolding realities. They would have refrained from partaking in those primal human events that led, or those primal human thought processes or experiences or conditions that led to the unfolding of divine reality in the 20th century.
So then who's Satan?
Well, finish the thought. So God hides the concept of the 20, or at least the vision of the 20th century from Adam, so that they may, according to the plan that God has set in motion, will follow the impulse to what appears to be disobedience. But when we look at it fully, we see that just as the Divine Mother, who is wisdom herself, who has descended into the world to bring forth children to heaven, to the Divine Father, that she might share this wonderful gift of life with their own, the fruit of their own relationship, which is life itself, and particularly the children that they will bring to a state of God consciousness. She now takes on the form of that temptress who later on in the Talmud and other mystical religious stories we know as Lilith. If the mother does not activate the evil impulse and draw us down into an experience with evil itself, which simply is a metaphor for human experience itself, we could not come full circle 6,000 years around and be on the verge of the birth of a coming age, because we would still be children in the Garden of Eden.
Then what's the serpent?
Well, now that we have come full circle, we have come back to the Garden of Eden, we have come back to the book of Genesis, and now we read the words, "And of all the trees in the garden you may freely eat." And that's why the scripture says, "Know every tree by its fruits. An evil tree cannot bring forth good fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit. Thereby you may know them by their fruits. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is in the midst of the paradise of God, or in the midst of the Garden of Eden, thou shalt not eat." Well, now we know exactly what God means, because we have, over the last 6,000 years, experienced the full effect of the evil impulse. We see evil for exactly what it is. We see that God has released the evil impulse from the places where it was latent and hidden in the depth of human potential, human consciousness. If God had at any time stopped the process, we would not have come to the time in which we are living, and we would not have seen evil for what it is. We now know what it looks like, because God in their infinite wisdom has allowed us the full experience of evil.
What's the point?
Well, the point is that God, when God released the evil impulse in the earth by giving Adamic man the ability to transgress the law, God also set in motion the conditions, and he set them in the heart of man and in the higher consciousness of man, the conditions through which the evil impulse will be overthrown. And so, from the very beginning of the story, we are introduced to the struggle that will begin then and come to its fruition now, the story of the struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, the higher impulse against the lower. And so in the creation story, we find that Eve, the church of her time, of those times, no doubt ruled over principally by male individuals, the chiefs of the tribe, the priests, and those who were connected to the natural forces. And this is why Paul says, I command the woman to be silent. He doesn't say, I command the female to be silent. I command the woman to be silent. The woman is anyone, whether they are a rabbi, a priest, a minister, an imam, no matter what religious tradition they are functioning in and practicing in, whether they are male or female, who does not understand the fact that female and woman do not mean the same thing, and do not understand the collective nature and the meaning of this epic in light and darkness which was set in the earth at that time, and therefore they have a very immature and imperfect sense of the meaning of light and darkness, the meaning of good and evil. And that's why the prophet Isaiah says, woe to them who call evil good and who call good evil. Almost everything the church defines as evil in our time is literally the manifestation of the presence of God in their most terrible form. Because you see, in the Garden of Eden, now we confront the idea of the serpent. Well, what is the serpent but the collective lower consciousness of man himself? And we understand the meaning of this great epic metaphor in our time when we gain a sight of the presence of the great continent, the Leviathan itself, which the Divine Mother is now revealing to us. Because as she descends into our generation, as she descends into our field of consciousness, she who is the wisdom of the planet herself, the living planet, is releasing out from the elements of the planet Earth herself the countenance of this great, immense continent of Leviathan. And once we see it, immediately we understand and we can interpret the entire epic. And that's why this dragon is called the serpent, that old devil and Satan which deceiveth the whole world. Once we see that in the metaphorical metaphysical and geological sense that the serpent, the dragon, is the earth itself, then we understand our relationship to the lower state of consciousness. God takes the earth, literally the elements of the serpent itself, and forms the lower nature of man. So when we read in the Garden of Eden of Eve being tempted by the serpent, well, it has everything to do with the modern practices of raising the Kundalini, raising the serpentine, the lower consciousness within every individual, and bringing it up the spiral of the cortex, which leads from the lower mind to the higher mind, bringing it up and seeing it for what it is. And once you see it, and once you understand its nature within ourselves, you begin to see how the serpent is actually a force that has been built into the creative order to help God bring man to this higher state of consciousness.
Stop.
Are we on? Almost.
We're sort of on. And it's okay if it takes us a little while to get back into
Yeah.
that
Groove.